Sa Bloodsucking Night ay tingnan sa Bloodsucking Night. At tingnan naman night. Tungkol ako ina-fright. Sa Bloodsucking Night ay
The story of Bloodsucking Night was based on the Bloodsucker trading cards created by the Toontown online team. Bloodsuckers always seem to love invading Toontown on Halloween night. I wanted to show how excited a bloodsucker would be in his preparation in dressing up as a vampire to scare Toons out trick-or-treating. To give him some character, I had the idea to make him sing. I imagined he wouldn't be able to hold in his joy at the chance to scare Toons on his one favorite night of the year and sing about it. Once I listened to the song, Pop Goes the Weasel by Kevin MacLeod, I knew I had found the perfect song for the video. I wrote the lyrics to flow with the song. Tonight's a cold Halloween night. Time to play in the moonlight. Toons will run home in a fright. It's a blood-sucking night. I wrote a simple story outline as a reference and skipped the process of sketching a storyboard. I drew only one sketch on my phone and it was of the bloodsucker in his vampire costume. After working primarily in the Panda 3D game engine for my first video, Flugged, I wanted to change it up and make the animation entirely in the Blender 3D software. The first thing I needed to do was figure out a way to get the Toontown game models into Blender for animations. At the time, back then in the year 2014, there wasn't an easy way to export the game models to be imported into Blender. The Blender Egg Importer add-on had not been released yet. And the Spotify Toontown version files were not available. I came up with a conversion process that worked for me through some trial and error testing. For all editing purposes, the first step was to extract the Toontown game files from the Phase Multi files. I used the Panda 3D Multify program to do this. The program extracted the game texture images, audio, model and animation files and more for me to work with. I could work with the image and audio files easily but not the model and animation files since they were all BAM files. The next step was to convert the model BAM files into EGG files using the Panda 3D program BAM2EGG. Then, I converted those EGG files into FLT files using the Panda 3D program EGG2FLT. Since newer versions of the Blender software had difficulties importing FLT files, I used an older version, Blender version 2.49, to import FLT file. Success! I could import the game models with their texture images applied correctly. Unfortunately, the character bones and animations data were lost during conversion. At that point, I could have started working on animations but I wanted to work in the newest versions of the Blender software. So, while in Blender 2.49, the next step was to export the FLT model as a OBJ file. Finally, I imported the OBJ file in newer versions of Blender to work on animations. I wrote some batch scripts to help speed up the process. Once I had the game models and textures in Blender, I could do everything I needed. The possibilities were endless. I even tested exporting the models for use in the Steam Source Filmmaker software and Unreal Game Engine. These two engines would have been useful for faster rendering capabilities in future animated videos. To get started working in Blender, I imported all of the models that I wanted to use for the video and made adjustments as necessary. For example, the Bloodsucker used the same head model as the mover and shaker. The texture image just needed to be changed. The head file contained multiple cog head models in it. I deleted the models that I didn't need, imported the cog suit model, and replaced the texture images. A similar process was used to set up the monkey tune, but it required 3 different files: the head, torso, and legs. Fun fact, the monkey tune in Bloodsucking Night was going to be the main character for my next animated short, Jellybean Addiction. I also had him wear a cowboy outfit as a reference to my doodle writing video. The Bloodsucker's casket was actually a modified cog safe. I adjusted the game model to look like a casket. For the Bloodsucker's cape, I adjusted Mickey's Halloween cape model to fit the cog and recolored it. Adjusting existing game models was helpful in saving time and keeping the art style close to the original game. I also needed to adjust the cog office environment model for the setting. The walls needed to be taller and fit together to enclose the area. Office equipment needed to be duplicated and placed around the scene for a visually crowded feeling in specific shots. Some models that I needed for the video were not in the original game, such as the makeup kit, powder brush, paint bucket, and paintbrush. So, I created these models and texture images in Blender. For example, I created the paintbrush by starting with a cube and making adjustments to its height, width, and depth. Then, I added more edge loops to change the shape of the model. I duplicated the top plane of the brush to begin modeling the handle. The process is basically adding points and edges, then moving them around to create the object form. I tried to keep the model geometry simple to fit the Toontown game style. To begin painting the texture image, I marked some edges as seams for unwrapping. Once unwrapped, I created an image texture and applied it to the model. Then, it was time to paint. I painted the texture by selecting brush colors and opacity levels and then moving the viewport around to paint on different areas of the model. I tried to keep the textures simple with a color palette that fit the game style. I adjusted the Bloodsucker's head texture image in Photoshop. Working in layers, I was able to get his vampire makeup on the way I wanted it. I had tested a texture image with a wider mouth and longer vampire teeth but decided to go with the tamer version. At that point, the character models were ready to be rigged with armature bones and weight painted. Armature bones helped in moving parts of the model geometry for animations. For example, a character's head model geometry would be assigned to the head bone. If I rotate the head bone, the character's head would rotate automatically. The animation process is so much faster and easier with them. I created custom armatures with bones that mimicked real-life skeletons and added some helper bones. Some of the bones included a head, chest, hips, shoulders, upper and lower arms, hands, upper and lower fingers, upper and lower legs, feet, and toes. The Bloodsucker and Vampire Bloodsucker were 2 separate models and rigs. I set up the Bloodsuckers to have an IK rig for the arms and legs. This allowed me to move around special controller bones and have other bones move accordingly. I added bones that control the shape of the vampire cape as well. For the monkey tune, I decided not to add the lower half bones to his armature to save time. Only his upper body would be shown and animated in the video anyways. Some inanimate object models were rigged with armature bones as well, such as the safe and casket. Next, with the armature bones ready, I used Blender's automatic weight assignment function to link model geometry to bones. It did a good job overall, but it still needed work, so I did my own custom weight painting to finish it. I painted the control strength for each bone. Red meant full control and blue meant no control. Colors in between varied in strength. Left hand geometry to left hand bone, right hand geometry to right hand bone, and so on. You wouldn't want your head bone to control your head and legs now, would you? So, with character rigging done, it was time to move on to setting up the scenes. There were 2 scenes for the animated short story. The first was inside the COG building in an office environment, and the second was outside the building. I added only the models that were necessary for the camera shots into the scene, and they were scaled, rotated, and moved into place. I also added various lights around the scene so the models could be rendered with 3-dimensional shading. More than 30 lights were added for the office setting alone for a dim, moody atmosphere. The outdoor scene was set up with the Lawbot COG building models and BossBot courtyard environment models. I moved the film camera around the scene to test various camera angles and movement shots during the scene setup stage. Knowing where my camera was going to be and what would be included in the shots allowed me to save time and skip creating a whole scene environment. This stage in the video making process was all about experimenting with different lights and camera angles to tell the story. The lighting was an important aspect of the scene to convey the dark moonlit night. Adding the characters to the scene also helped block out the cinematography. Fun fact, I included the Flunky backpack into the office scene as a reference to my previous video, Flunked. With everything set up, the time had come for the most fun and frustrating part of the film-making process: animation. I animated the characters by moving and rotating bones into place to create the pose that I wanted at specific keyframes in time. These keyframes were recorded in a timeline as yellow marks shown at the bottom of the software. I used a playback speed of 30 frames per second for this animated video. So, if I wanted a bone to move from one spot to another, in 1 second, I would create the first keyframe pose at frame 1 and the last keyframe at frame 30. The transition animation between keyframes would be automatically calculated by the software based on settings. The camera was animated the same way, but it did not have a bone. Instead, I only needed to change its actual position and rotation at specific times. I used both methods available to save keyframes. The first was to manually insert keyframes every time I wanted to save a bone pose. The second was to have the software automatically save any changes that I made to the bones. I always had multiple viewports open with different angles to help me animate. It allowed me to see where the model parts actually were in 3D space. This was a fun shot to create because I used 2D image planes with transparent textures to form the puffs of powder smoke. The images were angled towards the camera and animated to appear and float around the bloodsucker's face. An effective trick. My animating process was a build-up procedure. What I mean by this is that I like to start from the beginning of a shot sequence and pose the character one keyframe at a time. I began with main keyframe poses and then worked my way into transitional poses in between, playing back the animation over and over to see what it looks like through the final camera lens shot, making changes to bones and keyframe timings anywhere I thought it could improve the animation. Oftentimes, I would work on animations without textures to see the model shape and form. For this shot sequence, I wanted to have a dynamic and energetic feeling. So I moved the camera around more than usual and kept it unsteady the whole time. The animation and camera shots were animated with the music and song lyrics. I recorded myself singing the song in a slight Eastern European accent with a voice modifier on. and the final version was edited in the Audacity software to create a more robotic voice. I broke down the animations into several different shot files. There were 15 different camera animation shots and files for the video. This saved me the trouble of seeking through long animation timelines and protected all of my work from being lost if the file became corrupted. Once all of the animation sequences were complete and reviewed, it was time to start rendering the final version. Each frame of the animation went through the Blender internal rendering engine to generate the final image shot and combined to make a video. The images had all the lighting and shading calculations and special effects included in the scene while leaving out user-friendly control elements that shouldn't be shown in the final shot. Each individual frame could take from a few seconds to a few minutes to render depending on my CPU and the shot complexity. The total animation time was about 50 seconds, so at 30 frames per second, there were 1,500 images to render. If each image took an average of 8 seconds to render, the total time it took to render the entire animation was over 3 hours. When all of the animations finished rendering, I was able to move into video and audio editing. I used the Vegas Pro video editing software to combine the video shots and audio files together. Almost all of the animation shots that I rendered were used in the final video. I wanted to enhance the dark, cold, night setting for the story, so I used the color grading effects in the video editing software. More blue colors were added and the contrast was increased. I liked the new look and used it for the final cut. Finally, with video production done, I exported the final version of the animated short story and uploaded it online. I started the video with a few shots of the environment so you get curious. The bloodsucker wakes up from his nap inside his casket with joy. His excitement and tone of voice increases as he gets his vampire costume on. I gave him a glamour shot for the costume reveal and had him perform a short thriller-style dance before gliding for the exit. I love this shot of him smoothing his hair and brushing off the dust from his shoulders. He thinks he's so slick and ready to scare the night away. But little did he know, the trap was set by a mischief monkey Toon, and all his plans were going to be cancelled. Bye bye sucker. Maybe next time. I hope you enjoyed the video. Stay tuned-tastic.